Okay, great. So our second speaker today is Alexa Arevalo, who is a political science major. Alexa will be telling us about a comparative analysis of civil-military relations and democratization in Algeria and South Korea. Alexa.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your time being here today. So let's just get started. So why study democratization? Democracy is already widely studied in social science. Many scholars dedicate their studies in analyzing the benefits and advantages of democratic governance. So most of us are familiar with these advantages. For instance, studies show that democracies are associated with property rights, such as being able to own a business, political rights, such as participating in free and fair elections, and social rights, such as having the right to an education, access to basic needs, healthcare, and welfare provisions. So the image on this slide shows protests in Myanmar following the unexpected military coup that was staged earlier this year. Sources have documented over 700 civilian casualties, and more than 3,000 people have been arrested for partaking in protests. So as you can see, these rights are not equally allocated in authoritarian states, nor are they even guaranteed. Therefore, it's important to consider why some countries have remained vulnerable to authoritarianism over time. So democratization yields an interesting historical pattern when looking at it globally. This is that it seems like it occurs in waves. Another way to think about this is that it acts like a contagion. It starts in one country, but ultimately sweeps through an entire nation. For example, the third wave constituted democratic transitions in Latin America, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa. However, it's important to note that some countries subsequently fell back to authoritarianism. So this is what we refer to as backsliding or regression. Surprisingly, the Middle East and North Africa region was largely untouched by these waves. So I'll discuss in the next slide, the Arab Spring in 2011 demonstrated an anticipated prospect for democracy in this region. So in the Middle East and North African region, the phenomenon of the Arab Spring was very unanticipated. So what is it? In short, it was a series of unexpected popular anti-regime protests that swept through the region in 2011. Although this suggested prospects for transitions, I'm largely interested in the variations in transitional outcomes. For example, while Tunisia was successful, others were less so, as indicated by its figure. In addition to this, some countries remained silent during the Arab Spring, such as Algeria, and this is one of my case elections. Algeria did not experience the same degree of mass popular protest as its neighbors. This puzzle contradicts the widely proposed explanation that democratization is driven by geographic proximity to other democracies. Some have also proposed that the absence of democracy in MENA is attributable to Islam's incompatibility with democracy. But if this is the case, then we should not observe democracy in other countries with large Muslim populations. But this is contested by Indonesia and India. Lastly, the oil curse argument also cannot explain the lack of democratization. So with this background, my research was largely motivated by three key observations. First, the durability of authoritarian regimes varied within countries. While some regimes collapsed under protest, others didn't. Second, existing literature provides an extremely diverse set of explanations. In other words, different subfields in political science attempt to explain transitions with one variable or another. For example, scholars find that economic wealth and development are correlated with democratic prospects. Others find that international alliances and geographic proximity to democracy should result in transition. However, these explanations are missing a key mechanism that authoritarians rely on. Historical analysis show that authoritarians have relied on violence and repression to prevent opposition from rising. As such, part of my research examines military behavior and how it affects regime durability. So lastly, Democratic transitions need to be thought of and studied as a sequential process. When many quantitative studies and using statistical analysis fail to account for this. This simply means that transitions from authoritarianism to democratic governance is not an immediate outcome. This sequential process also explains why some countries are susceptible to backsliding while others are relatively stable. So here are my specifications and hypotheses. So when faced with exogenous and endogenous shocks, such as popular protests or factionalism within the regime, why do some regimes collapse while others survive? To answer this question, I decided to test 4 independent variables. First, studies in political economy suggest that foreign aid can be used to finance patronage systems and clientelism, which widens the support base of autocrats. Second, does regime type matter? Some research suggests that single-party regimes are more durable than other types of dictatorship. Third, do divisions within social groups in society prevent democratic transition? The rationale behind this explanation is that fragmentation will prevent collective action efforts in mobilizing against the regime. And then lastly, does military support for the regime matter? In other words, will the regime stand if the military stops backing the government, or will it deteriorate? So given these hypotheses, my research seeks to determine which variables hold the most weight. So I was interested in how my independent variables would perform under different contexts. Therefore, I opted to test my hypotheses in 2 different countries. Although the case selection only allows for a small and qualitative analysis, most research in comparative politics already focus on comparing the very similar cases. For example, they engage in interregional studies. So in order to contribute to existing research, I opted for a cross-regional analysis using South Korea and Algeria. So for reference, Algeria is still an authoritarian state according to the Freedom House Index. However, South Korea democratized by the late 1980s to early 1990s. And then to set a good foundation for comparative analysis, I began with a structured case studies of South Korea and Algeria, using presidential regimes as my units of analysis. Since this was a small N study, the case studies permitted me to increase my observations from 2 to 12. This helped prevent biases concerning having too many variables for 2 cases, which is relatively common in comparative analysis. So in addition to this, I used a most different systems design to examine my independent variables comparatively. The merit of this model is that it allows the comparison of different cases without running into selection bias. So it works by teasing out the key similarities between these different cases. So the key similarities between my cases are reflected by my independent variables. Both South Korea and Algeria received foreign development aid during periods of authoritarianism. They both experienced civilian and military authoritarian, ethnic or socioeconomic divisions were also observed. And lastly, both cases have histories of state militarization, meaning that the military can be explicitly observed in government roles. So my findings suggest some but inconsistent support for foreign aid, regime type, and fragmentation variables. Foreign aid receipts seem to matter more in non-oil producing authoritarian settings. This is because foreign aid gives authoritarians an allowance to finance patronage systems and clientelist networks. By contrast, Algeria has access to large oil reserves, which it can exploit to purchase loyalty. Regime type also performed inconsistently. However, they indicate that authoritarians' legitimizing principles and coup prevention strategies matter more than the structure of the regime. And then societal fragmentation yielded mixed results. Particularly, social mobilizations demonstrate the desire for political change, but is not sufficient in itself to cause democratic change. Of all the variables tested, only military withdrawal performed consistently in all regime observations except for 1. but I treated this one instance as an outlier since the regime leader died from natural causes. So why does the military choose to stop supporting a regime? So based on my aggregated data, my findings show correlation between a reduction in government military spending and regime collapse lagged by 1 year. This was followed by an increase in military spending and all authoritarian contexts observed. It's positively signed because higher budgets are associated with loyalty. In short, this indicates that authoritarians rely on appeasing the military to prolong the duration of their rule. And the figure on the right also supports my findings. Personal recruitment increased in anticipation of mass civil protests. In civil military relations, the proliferation of multiple security forces and counterbalancing are referred to as coup-proofing strategies. It's negatively signed because it creates functional rivals for the regular military, hurting its corporate interests. Together, I find that these were strong factors in assessing military withdrawal in South Korea and Algeria. So to sum up, my findings reveal that military support is necessary for regime durability. Military withdrawal is sufficient for regime collapse, but this doesn't mean that it may be sufficient for democratic transitions. There are also limitations in this study, since it's only analyzing 2 cases. So I have a few suggestions for future research concerning cross-regional analysis in civil military relations and democratization. First, a quantitative analysis using multi-level models can help with generalizability. Second, research should also focus on assessing transitions and regressions. This is important as seen in Myanmar earlier this year. Third, the MENA region should be comparably analyzed against other regions such as Latin America and East Asia. This will provide for a more comprehensive analysis. Right, thank you everyone for your time, and that wraps up my presentation.
Thank you, Alexa. This was really fascinating. You can go ahead and